So isn't the Christian epic prone to the same failures as the pagan and humanist civilizations before and after it? What do you think? We know the answer. Samuel Adams knew the answer, and he knew it from his knowledge of history, specifically the history of the European divine right kings. What was it that Adams knew and our founding fathers knew? That they abhorred the divine right kings, but at the same time, not the tenets of biblical Christianity that would drive them to the most radical and sweeping change in government structure in all of human history. That's the question we'll answer today, here on The American Truth. But first, we need to set the stage. By the 9th century, Christian roots were running deep across Europe, beating back ignorance and brutality of force for many. But humanism again reestablishes itself in the concentration of influence and spreads in a new form as robes of righteousness. Corruption of the popes and then the divine right kings established a pattern of powerful monarchs who ruthlessly ignored the rights of their people, took away their weapons, their land, and forced the masses into armies of personal conquest. But to gain insight into how this could occur within the church and what our founding fathers gleaned from this era, we need to take the next step. You see, after the fall of Rome, church leadership was true to its virtues. Case in point, Pope Leo I. Unbridled chaos of the Dark Ages, unscrupulous men sought any advantage, and other men would submit to any authority. And this was the world of Pope Leo I. He came up through the ranks from being a deacon and was a principal in maintaining the original doctrines of faith against heresy after heresy by the principle of law and a seemingly inexhaustible supply of patience. For example, he banished and then converted the Carthage heretics, not acting on his own accord, but from the authority of the constitution of Christian emperors. He was also a peacemaker. Personally, I love this one, personally persuading Attila the Hun in 452 not to sack the city of Rome. How did he do it? Well, they talked it over lunch, literally. He also convinced the Vandals to restrain from violence in sacking Rome in 455. The point here is this is the role of church leadership as it should be, maintaining the true doctrines of the gospel and applying moral influence to maintain the infrastructures of spiritual and personal freedom and liberty. However, by 800 AD, the power within Christian Rome was already being subverted. Pope Leo III was the chosen successor of Pope Adrian I in 795 AD. However, nephews, illegitimate sons, in powerful positions within the church organizes attack on Leo while he was in procession to deprive him of his eyes and tongue to disqualify him from the papal office. Receiving mutilations of the face and the eyes, he was rescued by Frankish Duke of Spoleto. He underwent a rather miraculous recovery and was under the protective custody of Charlemagne, Charles Martel's grandson. Instead of retaliation, he waited nearly 2 years for Charlemagne to arrive and decide the matter by court. Then come the plagues. Perhaps the most horrific of the epidemics can be traced to the port of Constantinople in 1347, possibly a ship from North Africa. From there, the disease crept through Europe at about 2 miles a day. Eventually, it entered the population centers of Europe. The plague resulted in 17 million deaths in just 3 years. The human loss of the plague is horrific enough. However, some historians note the socioeconomic fallout perhaps was even worse. Think about it. Human institutions, banking, insurance, commerce of every kind, even civil government, think taxes, is a pyramid structure with multitudes of young, vibrant workforce, investors, contributors at the bottom, sparser population of elders, mentors, financiers, intellectuals at the top. All that changed in 3 years. As a result, civilization in some regions literally collapsed. There are ruins in Europe where everyone died in the village. There was nobody left to bury the dead. And those ruins are still there. What happened to the survivors? Millions became beggars in poverty and pestilence, and a near total loss of faith. Life devolved into eking out a living as a vassal peasant, a slave subsistence. And the result of that was that there was no moral character left in the people. Think about this. For character is dependent upon the expectation of future opportunities, right? Well, with no future, given the odds, it was sort of every man for himself. Live life today, because tomorrow you could very well die. In fact, this became a major problem. Over 200 years, the church really lost all its influence as the population tried to readjust and tried to scramble. As a result, orgies were a cultural norm, even for the poor. The moral decay meant that no one was safe. I'll give you an example. In Germany, injured insane veterans, nobody knew what to do with them. They were rounded up and dumped in the forest to die of exposure. It really was every man for himself in face of the horror of the plagues. In the vacuum, the Roman Catholic Church became very powerful, and it jealously guarded its position, relying on, what do you think? Probably superstition, and relying on the ignorance of the people. The relationship, therefore, between the people and the church became monetary, with rich families who would buy high positions in the church for their sons. Peasants would pay from like cradle to grave. Child christening, marriage, burial. Oh, and in the interim, there was tithing, and tithing was mandatory. And you were expected to work church land at a certain number of days per week instead of providing for your family. As wealth accumulated in the church, so did the reach and corruption of power across the land. If that income were not enough, there was more. For example, there were relics. Think about this. Officially sanctioned by the Vatican were pieces of straw, hay, maybe a couple of white feathers from a dove, pieces of the cross that had supposedly been close to Jesus when he was on earth. You could pay for those. In fact, there's an example of one. The relic touched the tomb of Jesus. It's that piece right there, and it could be yours. Then there are indulgences, certificates produced in bulk, signed by the Pope, that pardoned a person's sins and gave them access to heaven. And that access extended even to the dead. Finally, there are pilgrimages. Say that again. Finally, there were pilgrimages. You could travel to a place of worship, owned by the church, of course, and from there you could pay for badges, holy water, and certificates that would prove that you've been there, done that, just like the t-shirt. As St. Augustine predicted, God was replaced with a humanist hope from a Roman Catholic church that was rotting with hypocrisy. A church overrun by Plato's humanism disguised as righteousness. Using the justification, leaders must interpret the truth and act for the redemptive good of the people under the guise of Christ's will. Now, for those of you who think, gee, this history is rather interesting, but it can't possibly be relevant today, you might be surprised at our next step. This is a doctrine called social redemption, and it's a very important concept these days. Is history relevant? Well, in the not too distant past, different labels, different government rulers invoked the doctrines of the corrupt papacies of old. To do what? To justify a massive tax increase on American self-reliance. And for 48 million Americans, they never saw the deception and the justification, even though that deception has been used throughout history. Join us next time here on the Divine Right King's Experiment.